Remembrance, Reckoning, and Myth in Stories of the Dead, a critical review. Introduction. F.D. Bush's Stories of the Dead is an ambitious fusion of post-apocalyptic horror and metaphysical myth-making, comprising two narrative volumes, Psilocybin and The Red Wedding, alongside two doctrinal texts, Liber Anthropophaticus and Liber Initiatorum Mortis. This interconnected universe positions itself as more than a straightforward zombie saga. Bush blends survival narrative with invented scripture and occult philosophy, crafting a work of philosophical horror that invites intellectual as well as visceral engagement. The result is a formally daring, mythopoeic cycle that demands serious consideration of its literary merit, thematic cohesion, stylistic execution, and narrative risks. This review will examine each component, the narrative volumes and the doctrine texts, before assessing their unity and the author's vision. Bush's choice to release the story incrementally, piece by piece, will be considered in light of the work's unfolding mythic structure and its implications for readers. Throughout, we will compare Bush's fictional doctrines to real-world mystical frameworks, from Hermeticism to Gnosticism, to illuminate the philosophical depths of Stories of the Dead. The tone here is appropriately serious and rigorous, as befitting readers drawn to speculative horror with metaphysical weight. Narrative volumes, Psilocybin and The Red Wedding. What follows contains spoilers of the Stories of the Dead novels. If you have not finished volumes 1 and 2, do not proceed further. Rather, click the link in the description to listen to the Stories of the Dead audiobook playlist. Bush's narrative volumes form the backbone of Stories of the Dead, following the journey of Psilocybin, a 58-year-old hermit and reluctant witness to civilization's collapse. Volume 1, Psilocybin, opens not with urban chaos, but in a liminal space of ancient quiet. In the old forests of southwestern Russia, long before the roads crumbled and the cities grew silent, there was a clearing known only to those who still listened to the land. Untouched by satellite or scripture, where smoke curled slowly toward the stars, and the trees whispered to one another in the wind. This evocative scene immediately signals Bush's stylistic approach, lush, almost folkloric prose that elevates the horror setting into the realm of myth. The tone is one of reverence and foreboding. Fire is sacred, and silence means something in this world. By situating the genesis of his apocalypse in a shaman's campfire prophecy, Bush frames the zombie outbreak not as cheap thrill, but as the fulfillment of an older, cyclic doom. Indeed, in that opening chapter, a shaman spoke of the wheel of life, of cycles unheeded, and of a coming reckoning, a pivotal foreshadowing that casts the oncoming plague as cosmic retribution for humanity's negligence. This is a zombie tale operating on the level of archetype and fate. Volume 1 chronicles the initial stages of the fall, as the apocalypse is known, primarily through Phil's eyes. Phil is portrayed not as a larger-than-life hero, but as an everyman survivor, marked by age, loss, and silence. Bush's characterization is subtle, yet effective. Phil's weathered presence, 58 winters to his name, and the weight of twice that in his eyes, with a wild graying beard and a gaze that has seen too much and trusts too little, grounds the story in pathos. He survives the sudden contagion and onslaught not by combat skill or bravado, but by instinct and caution. When chaos erupts at the forest festival, infected victims attacking the living, Phil simply runs, leaving behind his younger cousin Joe, in a scene that haunts him thereafter. This choice, flight over fight, is a narrative risk that Bush takes with his protagonist. It makes Phil less conventionally heroic, yet far more human and poignant. The literary merit here lies in the restraint. Bush favors psychological realism and emotional truth over genre cliché. The horror elements, the infected lunging at victims, a horde at Joe's heels, are certainly present, described with visceral urgency, but the real emphasis is on Phil's trauma and guilt as a survivor. Volume 1 ends on an elegiac note, with Phil living feral and alone for weeks in the woods, worn and hollowed, nearly mute from shock, until he stumbles upon a last remnant of civilization, a fortified settlement in the wilderness. The final image is quietly powerful. Phil stands trembling at the edge of a clearing, weeping silently as a gentle breeze dries the tear in his eye. Bush closes Volume 1 with this tableau of fragile hope and profound loneliness, daring to let silence and emotion, rather than action, carry the climax. Volume 2, The Red Wedding, shifts gears, expanding the scope from solitary survival to communal crisis. It chronicles what happens when Phil enters that settlement, known simply as the township, and experiences a brief, illusory haven of order. If Volume 1 was about isolation, Volume 2 is about the dangerous allure of society reborn. Bush frames this volume with deliberate intertextual irony. The Red Wedding evokes the infamous massacre from Game of Thrones, preparing the reader for a story of hope turned to horror. Indeed, the narrative arc of Volume 2 follows this trajectory. As an opening epigraph in the volume's epilogue notes, The Red Wedding began with a fragile thread of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world had one last safe place left. Psilocybin came to the gates of the township not as a warrior nor as a prophet, but as a man worn down by grief and time. And yet, what he found there was not rest, but reckoning. This passage encapsulates the tragic structure of the novel. The sanctuary Phil finds is temporary and ill-fated, setting the stage for a reckoning both personal, Phil cannot remain the passive hermit, and societal, no refuge escapes the consequences of the fall. In The Red Wedding, Bush displays strong narrative pacing and tension. The first half of the volume builds a sense of uneasy hope. The township is described as a patchwork society clinging to fragile order, a symbol of stubborn humanity, of the final breath before the plunge. We meet a cast of survivor characters: a sheriff, a mayor, a nurse, and guards, who, though sketched with pulpy monikers, represent flickers of personality and community in the bleak landscape. Here, Bush takes another narrative risk. He infuses the story with almost comic book flourishes. The leaders are literally called Mayor Krusty and Sheriff Prawn, walking a fine line between archetype and caricature. Yet any potential camp is swiftly undercut by the gravity of events. The volume's centerpiece is The Red Wedding itself, a catastrophic attack on the township by an emergent authoritarian faction calling themselves the New World Order. Bush's handling of this climax is intense and unflinching. Chapter titles like Baptism by Blood signal the carnage, and indeed the siege is depicted through gunfire echoing around a church and the settlement going up in flames. The violence is chaotic and harrowing, but importantly, it is never gratuitous. It serves to illustrate the novel's philosophical contention that safety in such a world is illusory. By the end of Volume 2, the township lies in ruins, its defenders dead or scattered. In the aftermath, morning light falls on a crooked steeple, and dust, floated on the beams like ash, over the ruins of the township, a haunting image of beauty and despair. If Volume 1 was about the end of the old world, Volume 2 is about the failure of the first attempts at a new one. In literary terms, Bush succeeds in escalating the stakes and broadening the thematic scope, while maintaining a tight focus on Phil's personal evolution. Phil is scarred, literally disfigured in the battle, and forced out of anonymity. As the epilogue observes, this marks the end of an era where survival meant merely hiding for him. The Red Wedding thus fulfills the promise of Volume 1's setup. It pushes the protagonist from passive witness to active participant in whatever comes next, setting the stage for further installments. The literary merit of these narrative volumes lies in Bush's melding of horror conventions with a thoughtful character study and rich thematic undercurrents. His prose is notably above average for the genre, atmospheric, at times lyrical, yet capable of razor-sharp clarity in scenes of action or terror. Descriptive passages often carry symbolic weight, as when Phil's first sight of the township is described as the shape of civilization, not the old one, twisted by convenience and illusion, but something raw and human, built from ruin. Moments like these show Bush's talent for infusing the post-apocalyptic setting with meaning. Civilization itself is a character, reborn in rough form and awaiting its trials. The thematic cohesion across volumes 1 and 2 is also praiseworthy. Volume 1's motif of the Wheel of Life and unheeded cycles reverberates in Volume 2, where we literally see history beginning to repeat. A nascent community, a new struggle for power, another fall. The narrative volumes work in tandem to illustrate the book's core philosophical question: what endures when the world ends? The answer, suggested by Phil's story, is memory, remembrance, and moral accountability, reckoning. These themes are even encoded in the series' subtitle, A Novel of Remembrance and Reckoning, and are borne out by Phil's journey from haunted observer to someone who must act on the lessons of the past. In terms of narrative risk, Bush's choices could have misfired in less capable hands. The deliberate pacing and contemplative tone, especially in Volume 1, defy the mainstream expectation that zombie fiction be relentless and gore-driven. Some readers seeking straightforward horror may find the first volume slow or overly introspective. But for readers of philosophical or speculative horror, this slow burn is a feature, not a bug. Bush is unafraid to let tensions simmer and to prioritize world-building and mood over constant action. Another risk is the abrupt shift in Volume 2 from intimate survival tale to larger ensemble conflict. However, Bush manages this shift by keeping Phil at the emotional center and by using the township and its demise as a microcosm of the book's grander ideas: hope, order, and their collapse. Even the cheeky allusion in the title The Red Wedding is a gamble, potentially inviting comparison to a landmark pop culture moment. But Bush earns the title by delivering a payoff that is thematically resonant with his universe. In short, the narrative volumes succeed as both a gripping story of apocalyptic survival and a scaffold for the series' philosophical architecture. They are deliberately incomplete in themselves, each ending on a to-be-continued note. Yet each volume feels distinct in focus, one of solitude and prophecy, one of community and violent revelation. This incremental narrative method ties directly into Bush's authorial approach, which we will discuss later. Doctrine texts, Liber Anthropropheticus and Liber Initiatorum Mortis. What follows contains spoilers of the stories of the dead doctrines. If you have not finished both doctrines, do not proceed further. Rather, click the link in the description to listen to the Stories of the Dead audiobook playlist. Augmenting the two novels, Bush has composed two doctrinal companion texts that deepen the lore and philosophical underpinnings of Stories of the Dead. These are presented as in-world documents of the fictional post-fall universe, Liber Anthropropheticus, subtitled The Anthroprophetic Bible, and Liber Initiatorum Mortis, or The Teachings of the Three Witnesses. Each serves a different role in the mythos, and each showcases Bush's commitment to thematic richness and intertextual dialogue with real-world mystical traditions. Liber Anthropropheticus is essentially the scripture of Bush's fictional world, a mythic chronicle that spans from creation to apocalypse. Written in the elevated style of a holy book, complete with Latin passages and translated verses, it reads like an apocryphal blend of Genesis and Revelation, reimagined for a cyclical, post-human cosmology. The text is organized into 7 books, or libri, each corresponding to a stage of the cosmic drama and a balance between opposing forces. In this mythology, the universe, called the All, begins with a fundamental duality. In the beginning, there were two, and the two made one, and the one made all. And history unfolds through a series of equilibriums, balances struck and broken. Bush's fictional scripture recounts a familiar arc of fall and redemption, but with its own esoteric symbolism. There is a fall of man, echoing Eden, described as the separation from the All, a great flood, Diluvio Magno, the rise of proud cities and iron wars, plagues, and finally a resurrectio carnis, literally a resurrection of the flesh, i.e., the dead rising, which is the in-world explanation for the zombie apocalypse. By couching the zombie outbreak in prophetic terms, post-plague, vignette stella sanguinis, et post bestium, resurrectio carnis, meaning after the plague will come the blood star, and after the beast, the resurrection of the flesh. Bush daringly conflates survival horror tropes with religious eschatology. The Liber Anthropropheticus positions the living dead not as a mere infection, but as the final sign of an epical cycle, the last equilibrium before a hoped-for renewal of the world. Philosophically, Liber Anthropropheticus emphasizes balance above all. It preaches a kind of cosmic dualism where light and dark, creation and destruction, mercy and severity are all halves of a necessary whole. All that was made in balance, and balance is the child of the All, the text declares, insisting that there is no light without shadow, nor mercy without sternness, nor life without death. In the law, 2 divine or cosmic principles are named, Eris and Carthage. Eris is a guardian of the heart, a figure or force of preservation and compassion, while Carthage tests the soul through adversity. These are not crude stand-ins for God and devil, but rather complementary agents of equilibrium. They are not rivals, they are counterweights, as another doctrine text later clarifies. This nuanced dualism recalls real-world mystical frameworks such as Hermeticism and certain strands of Gnosticism, which often stress the union of opposites and seek hidden knowledge in paradox. Bush's fictional scripture indeed has a Hermetic flavor. It uses the term the All, a central concept in Hermetic writings, and its core ethos that blessed are they who keep balance even in the hour of ruin, for they shall be the foundation of the new world, resonates with Hermetic and Eastern philosophies that prize equilibrium. One might hear echoes of the Tao or the Buddhist middle path, refracted through apocalyptic imagery. There are also resonances of Gnostic myth. Humanity's ignorance of these cosmic principles leads to its downfall, just as in Gnostic thought ignorance and the blindness imposed by the demiurge traps souls in a broken world. Liber Anthropophaticus is, in effect, the mythic backbone of stories of the dead's universe. It gives the horror a metaphysical context, elevating the stakes from mere survival to a question of whether humanity can achieve concordia eterna, eternal harmony, after a spiral of catastrophes. As a piece of writing, it stands out for its stylistic audacity. Bush authentically mimics the cadences of scripture and even composes passages in Latin for an air of antiquity and gravity. For instance, the text concludes with a solemn Latin colophon, asserting that it was written not by one, but by many in one spirit. Not author, but instrument. Not hand, but the mind of the all wrote. This level of detail in world building, inventing a sacred text, complete with chaptered structure, prophecy, and liturgical tone, is a bold commitment to mythopoeia. The risk is that some readers may skim these dense doctrinal passages, but for those who relish the Silmarillion side of fantasy or the invented theologies of speculative fiction, Liber Anthropophaticus is a feast of ideas and atmosphere. Complementing the grand mythos of the anthropophatic Bible is Liber Initiatorum Mortis, the teachings of the three witnesses. If the former is scripture, this text is more like a post-apocalyptic philosophical treatise or survival manual. Framed as the collected essential teachings of the anthropophatic doctrine, Liber Initiatorum Mortis claims to distill the secret principles that allowed some to endure the end of the world. Its tone is didactic and occult, explicitly invoking the Kybalion, an early 20th century Hermetic text. In its opening epigraph, the lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. This quote is a wink to the reader. Bush is openly aligning his fictional doctrine with the Hermetic tradition of hidden wisdom revealed only to the adept. Indeed, what follows is a clear parallel to the 7 Hermetic principles famously outlined in the Kybalion. Liber Initiatorum Mortis methodically enumerates the 7 principles as follows: mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. Each is given in the same order and with nearly identical axioms as the Hermetic canon, e.g., all reality arises from mind, mentalism. The inner and outer mirror one another. Correspondence. Nothing is still. Vibration. Opposites differ only by degree. Polarity. All things rise and fall. Rhythm. Nothing occurs without consequence. Cause-effect. And creation requires union of opposing forces. Gender. Bush does not hide this inspiration. Rather, he uses it as a scaffold to build his universe's philosophy of survival. Each principle is revealed in turn, with an explanation tailored to the world of the dead. For example, the classic Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, the principle of correspondence, is transformed into a grim reflection on the zombie plague. The dead are feedback. They are the world answering humanity honestly. As within, so without. As despair, so ruin. As discipline, so endurance. Here, Bush's text suggests that the rise of the dead is a direct correspondence to humanity's inner state, a karmic mirror of our despair and moral decay. In a similar vein, the principle of rhythm, which in Hermeticism speaks to cycles and pendulum swings, is invoked to explain why in this world safe zones always fall, why peace never lasts, and why the dead return after every clearing. The swing cannot be stopped. It can only be anticipated. The didactic clarity of such lines is striking. Bush wants the reader to see the horror not as random, but as lawful, an accurate working out of natural principles. The philosophical merit of Liber Initiatorum Mortis lies in this synthesis of metaphysical law with pragmatic survival insight. It reads at times like a stern handbook for the apocalypse, stripping away comforting illusions. These teachings will not make you safe, the text warns. They will make you accurate. They will remove excuses. They will explain why the world could not be saved. There is a cold comfort in this approach. The doctrine explicitly rejects both religious succor and scientific optimism. It is not a religion, though religions have borrowed from it. It is not a prophecy of what will happen, but an explanation of why the same endings always arrive. This places the work's philosophy in the realm of fatalistic realism akin to Stoicism or even cosmic existentialism. The universe of stories of the dead is one governed by indifferent laws, and those who survive do so by understanding and yielding to those laws, not by divine grace or heroic will. For instance, the principle of cause and effect in the text delivers a blunt verdict on the apocalypse. The collapse was not sudden, it was cumulative. The world did not break these principles, it was broken by ignoring them. Every ignored warning, every act of human hubris was a cause whose effect has finally come due. The prose here edges into moral commentary on our real world. One can't help but think of climate change, pandemics, or other crises that are cumulative and rooted in denial. Bush's doctrine speaks with the voice of hard truth. There are no accidents. Humanity chose its fate through action, inaction, and denial. The harvest is not random, it is accounting. Such lines carry a grave weight. They transform the zombie apocalypse from a grotesque fluke into a judgment upon human folly, rendered in quasi-mystical but incisive terms. Stylistically, Liber Initiatorum Mortis is written in a measured, aphoristic style that will remind genre-savvy readers of other fictional occult texts, e.g., the Necronomicon pastiches in Lovecraftiana, or the didactic tone of Machen's or Borges's pseudo-treatises. Bush's effort stands out because it isn't mere flavor text. It's directly integrated with the narrative's themes and even its plot. The three witnesses of the title imply in-world characters who have compiled this doctrine after seeing the end. The narrative volumes indeed suggest there are wise survivors, or a cult, who interpret these principles. The text even critiques a misapplication by a cult, noting that the cult believes this principle grants authority. They mistake inevitability for permission. This interplay between story and doctrine enriches the universe. We come to understand that different factions of survivors either adhere to or perversely distort the anthroprophetic teachings, a dynamic reminiscent of how real sacred texts get used or misused by those in power. The doctrine text thus not only provides philosophical commentary, but also world-building context for conflicts among the living. Indeed, the New World Order villains of Volume 2 literally embody the hunger for power that the doctrine warns about. In comparing Bush's fictional doctrines to real-world frameworks, the influence of Hermeticism is most explicit. The lifted seven principles and the concept of the all are direct homages. Bush effectively reimagines Hermetic teachings in a survival setting, demonstrating the versatility of those ideas. Readers versed in Hermetic or New Age philosophy will recognize the language and be intrigued or amused by its application to zombie lore. There are shades of Gnosticism too, the emphasis on hidden knowledge for the elect capable of understanding, and the idea that the world's rulers, or in this case the masses, were ignorant of reality's true nature and thus doomed themselves, align with Gnostic thought. The anthropropheticus mythos of the all and the fall of man has a Gnostic ring. Humanity separated from the all, wandering through cycles of ruin until perhaps achieving reunification in a concordia eterna, eternal harmony. Even the figure of Eris has a faint echo of Sophia, wisdom from Gnostic lore, while Carthag's testing role is akin to the demiurgic or adversarial forces that unwittingly further the divine plan by challenging the soul. The doctrines also resonate with Eastern philosophy in their insistence on balance and the unity of dualities. One might compare Eris Carthage to yin and yang, or the seven equilibriums to the Hindu concept of cyclical yugas. Yet Bush's stew of influences never feels derivative in a lazy way. Rather, it comes across as a conscious conversation with these traditions. The fictional doctrine is meta in the best sense. It knows its own roots. By quoting the Kybalion and using a biblically ornate style, Bush invites the reader to place stories of the dead within the continuum of humanity's meaning-making systems, myth, scripture, occult philosophy, all of which have historically been used to cope with plagues and apocalypses of their times. From a critical standpoint, one could argue that these doctrine texts carry a risk of didacticism or could alienate readers who came purely for horror entertainment. Not every horror fan will want to pause for a metaphysics lesson, however colorful. Bush mitigates this by segregating the texts. They can be read alongside the narrative or separately at the reader's leisure. This modular design is clever. The doctrine enriches the story for those inclined to dive in, but it doesn't interrupt psilocybin's tale with long expository monologues. In terms of execution, both Liber Anthropophaticus and Liber Initiatorum Mortis are impressively consistent and imaginative. They feel like artifacts from the world Bush has created, lending the stories of the dead universe a rare depth and credibility. Just as Tolkien's Silmarillion gave Middle-earth a creation myth, Bush's doctrinal texts give his post-collapse world a past and a philosophy. In the genre of zombie fiction, which is often content with surface-level survival scenarios, this approach is refreshingly ambitious. Stylistic unity and thematic cohesion. Considering the diverse formats of stories of the dead, novel, scripture, tractate, one might expect tonal dissonance or fragmentation. Yet one of Bush's notable achievements is how these pieces speak to each other to form a coherent whole. The stylistic execution across the works, while varied by necessity, remains unified by a serious, mythic tone and a set of recurring motifs that bind the reader's experience together. The most obvious unifier is the voice of the authorial narrator, which is measured, somber, and rich with symbolism, whether we are reading narrative or doctrine. Bush has a clear authorial voice that comes through as thoughtful and unflinching. In the novels, this voice shows in the descriptive narration and the reflective asides. In the doctrine texts, it shows in the authoritative, lapidary pronouncements. In both cases, the voice treats the subject matter with gravity. There is a palpable respect for the horror and wonder of the world's end. Even when the narrative dips into the visceral, e.g. gory attacks, frantic chases, Bush's prose avoids gratuitous shock. Instead, there's often a sense of the sublime amidst terror, as when he describes a silent forest full of dread as the world itself was holding its breath, or when he juxtaposes a child's laughter with the stillness of a ruined world to poignant effect. This consistent tone helps the doctrinal sections feel like a natural extension of the story's universe rather than a jarring appendix. Reading Liber Anthropophaticus, for example, one encounters the same imagery of fire, silence, and cycles that pervade Phil's journey. The shaman's campfire prophecy of a coming reckoning finds its echo in the scripture's decree that, when the final hour shall sound, the voice of Eris and Carthage shall resound as one. Both foretell a decisive moment of truth. The wheel motif is another thread. The shaman speaks of the wheel of life. In Volume 1's afterword, Bush writes, "The wheel keeps turning, as does the cycle." And the entire doctrine is essentially a model of cyclical time. Such echoes are not coincidence. They are evidence of careful orchestration, giving the reader the sense of a grand design behind the storytelling. The thematic cohesion is even more pronounced. Across all texts, certain key themes are reiterated: memory versus oblivion, knowledge versus ignorance, balance versus hubris, and the human capacity for endurance. Memory is foregrounded from the start. The narrative is presented as fragments of something true, a record, a warning, a memory. This archival conceit, the story compiled from journals and broadcasts, not only lends realism, but ties into the doctrine's idea that those who remember and understand the past, the witnesses, are the ones who survive and carry wisdom forward. The idea of witnessing recurs. Phil is a reluctant witness to collapse, and the doctrine text is literally by three witnesses. In a Gnostic or Hermetic sense, to witness is to attain gnosis, to see reality as it is. Bush uses this concept to align the personal arc, Phil's awakening to the truth of his world, with the cosmic arc, humanity's potential awakening to the all or the equilibrium. Knowledge versus ignorance is thus a binding theme. The characters who listen, Phil listening to the shaman for instance, are contrasted with those who blunder blindly, the outsiders who bring sickness to the forest festival, or the New World Order thugs who think brute power can reset civilization. The doctrine explicitly states, humanity was not destroyed by catastrophe, but by misunderstanding the nature of reality itself, a line that could serve as the thesis for the entire saga. Meanwhile, balance versus hubris is illustrated on multiple levels. The macro story of the fall is one of humanity upsetting the balance, with overweening cities, wars, experiments, all hinted in the scripture, and being corrected by collapse. On the micro story level, in Volume 2, the township's fragile balance is broken by the violent ambition of the invaders, showing again how power unchecked by equilibrium leads to ruin. The Anthropophaticus Beatitude, "Blessed are they who keep balance even in the hour of ruin," could apply equally to an individual maintaining moral balance, e.g., Phil retaining his humanity amidst chaos, as to communities or societies. Finally, the theme of endurance is embodied by Phil and others who persist. There are no supermen here, only what Bush calls witnesses who endured. Endurance itself is elevated to a sacred act. The sacred act of simply noticing, as Bush beautifully writes of Phil's solitary journey. Survival is not just a physical contest, it's a spiritual one, of retaining one's capacity to witness and remember in the face of annihilation. In this way, the thematic concerns of the doctrine texts, why some endure and most do not, loop back directly into the narrative's character arcs. One might ask, does the stylistic experiment of mixing novelistic storytelling with pseudo-scriptural exposition actually work as literature? Largely, yes. Bush's stylistic unity comes from his consistent seriousness and the interplay of content. When reading the narrative volumes, one senses the mythic depth behind events even if one hasn't yet read the doctrine, because the characters themselves speak in almost archetypal terms, e.g., the shaman's prophecy, the symbolic naming of chapters like the hermit emerges or baptism by blood. Conversely, when reading the doctrine texts, the abstract principles are continually brought to life by references to the world of the dead. For instance, the principle of vibration mentions why the clever outlive the armed. The dead do not hunt strategy, they hunt stillness, directly invoking the behavior of zombies in the narrative. Thus, each format illuminates the other. This cross-referencing ensures that the reader who engages with all parts is rewarded with a multidimensional understanding of the story's universe. It's akin to how reading Tolkien's appendices or histories gives The Lord of the Rings a greater poignancy, except Bush places those appendices in parallel with his main tale, letting us toggle between the immediate and the eternal. Of course, this ambitious structure could risk overwrought self-importance if not handled carefully. There are moments where the weight of exposition could have dragged down the pace, but Bush wisely keeps the doctrine texts separate and concise. Each is under 30 pages and segmented for digestibility. The narrative itself isn't overloaded with metaphysical monologues. Characters act and speak believably for their situations, while the broader commentary happens in the supplemental texts and authorial voice. This separation of concerns allows the stylistic integrity of each part to flourish without tonal whiplash. When a reader does choose to integrate the knowledge from the doctrines back into the story, it clicks smoothly. Suddenly, Phil's reticence, the repeated references to cycles, or the fatalistic events all acquire an added layer of meaning. In a way, Bush has structured an interactive puzzle for his audience. The texts invite us to piece together the full cosmology and message, much as the survivors in the story might piece together old journals and teachings to make sense of their world. This makes reading Stories of the Dead a more immersive and intellectually engaging experience than a linear horror novel. It respects the reader's curiosity and intelligence, expecting us to notice patterns and draw connections. For readers who delight in rich mythological subtext, the Mythopoeia crowd, this is a satisfying unity of form and content. For those less inclined, the main story can still stand on its own as a sobering tale of apocalypse, though admittedly, one might miss the full import without the context of the doctrines. Authorial vision and incremental unfolding. F.D. Bush's authorial vision for Stories of the Dead is nothing short of epic. In afterwords and metatextual comments, Bush reveals his intention to build an ecosystem of stories that will be released piece by piece, gradually unveiling the complete narrative and its world. This volume is the beginning, not just of a saga, but of an ecosystem of tales rooted in something deeper than fiction. Bush writes at the close of Volume 1, going on to explain that the work draws on hermetic concepts woven in shadow and philosophical ponderings about the nature of decay, rebirth, and perception. This statement is telling. Bush conceives of his fiction as a living, breathing mythology, deeper than fiction, and explicitly acknowledges the philosophical and mystical ideas fueling it. His goal is not just to tell a scary story of zombies, but to use that story as a vehicle for exploring profound questions of meaning, survival, and human nature. In a sense, he is performing a bit of a magic trick that horror occasionally pulls off at its best, smuggling existential philosophy into the reader's mind under cover of nightmarish entertainment. One of the boldest aspects of Bush's vision is his incremental release strategy. Rather than publishing a single doorstopper novel or a finished series all at once, he is delivering Stories of the Dead in installments, 2 volumes and 2 doctrine texts so far, with more promised. This approach has a few important implications. First, it mirrors the way mythologies and scriptures themselves often develop over time. Just as religious texts accrete, with new chapters, gospels, or commentaries emerging across generations, Bush's universe grows organically, allowing earlier parts to inform later ones and vice versa. Readers become participants in the unfolding myth, speculating between releases, rereading older parts for clues, and anticipating revelations. This episodic method can heighten engagement, especially for a community of readers who enjoy dissecting every hint. And Bush certainly plants many subtle clues, the afterwards reference every subtle clue being aligned by an internal logic. On the other hand, incremental storytelling is a narrative risk in itself. It demands patience and trust from the audience. There is always the possibility that threads introduced might not pay off, or that the final picture may not satisfy the build-up. So far, however, Bush has managed expectations well by thematically completing each installment even as larger mysteries remain. Volume 1 established the tone and central character. Volume 2 delivered a pivotal turning point and hinted at the broader conflict. The doctrinal texts, released alongside or between the narrative volumes, provide partial catharsis by revealing the why behind events, even if the what next is yet to come. Thus, readers are given answers in one dimension, philosophical, while suspense persists in another, plot, keeping the experience both intellectually fulfilling and dramatically tense. Bush's incremental approach also speaks to a keen awareness of modern multimedia storytelling. Notably, Stories of the Dead has been made available in multiple formats. The user's references to YouTube audiobooks and PDF downloads show Bush leveraging free distribution. This suggests an open-source mythos, where the author might be prioritizing reaching an audience and building a following over traditional publishing. In spirit, this is reminiscent of how creepypasta stories or ARG narratives unfold, pieces released into the world for a community to assemble. Bush's vision, however, is more literary and controlled. He isn't relying on user-generated content, but carefully crafting each fragment. The incremental rollout could be a practical strategy, writing and releasing in parts, perhaps in response to reader feedback or the author's evolving ideas, and an artistic one, mirroring the theme that truth comes in fragments and must be patiently stitched together, just as the story itself is stitched together from found journals. There is a self-reflective quality to Bush's commentary on this process. In Volume 2's epilogue, he writes, "The events within this book are not just fiction. They are memory, twisted, coded, resurrected, rooted in the psychological truth of a world where order collapses and character is revealed in its ashes." This metafictional wink, twisted, coded, resurrected, could just as well describe Bush's storytelling method. He is taking familiar motifs, memories of our cultural myths, codes from real philosophies, resurrected genres, and twisting them into something new. He wants us to consider that Stories of the Dead is not just fiction, in the sense that it's aiming for a truth beyond the literal. The authorial vision here is comparable to what we see in the best speculative fiction, an intent to use imagination as a lens on reality. When Bush notes that the series grew from memories, from myths, from moments where silence said more than words, he is aligning himself with a tradition of writers who turn personal or collective anxieties into allegorical tales. The fear that the end won't come with fire, but with stillness, one of Bush's most haunting phrases, shows how his personal quiet terror about societal collapse became the seed of this creative work. This kind of introspective honesty in the afterwords reveals a lot about his goals. He is not merely trying to shock or entertain, he is grappling with the meaning of apocalypse. In doing so, he joins authors like Mary Shelley, Richard Matheson, or even Octavia Butler, who used end-of-the-world scenarios to explore human nature and ethical philosophy. The philosophical and literary ambition of Bush's vision is commendable. He aims to unite the visceral impact of horror with the reflective depth of philosophical fiction. Few horror writers attempt to craft a full-fledged mythopoeia, a new mythos with its own cosmogony and teachings within a modern narrative. Those that do, perhaps Clive Barker in Imagica or Dan Simmons weaving philosophical texts into the Hyperion cantos, often risk overwhelming the reader. Bush navigates this by keeping the prose accessible even when the ideas are complex. The doctrines, while archaic in style, are lucid in content. The novels, while literary, still deliver on tension and character. His vision also has a strong moral undercurrent without being preachy. The story forces us to ask, what caused the fall of humanity? And by extension, what flaws in us might cause our own downfall? The answer Bush gives is sobering: ignorance, imbalance, loss of meaning. But he also plants the seed of hope in the notion that understanding and memory, the remembrance of his subtitle, can guide a rebirth. It's fitting that psilocybin's quote closes Volume 1, "I am you, you are me, and we are us," a simple statement of unity that borders on the mystical. In the context of the series, this quote, dated circa 2026 in the story, hints that Phil's journey will lead to a revelation of interconnectedness, perhaps his personal gnosis that echoes the doctrine of the all. Bush, as an author, clearly wants the reader to arrive at a similar sense of connection between ourselves and our world, between past and present, between one another. This thematic destination is one reason the incremental release feels appropriate. It allows time for contemplation and for the audience to mentally engage with these connections rather than rushing to a finish. In sum, Bush's authorial vision is intellectually rigorous and deeply serious, exactly as one would aim for when writing philosophical horror. He treats his audience with respect, assuming we will pick up on allusions and grapple with big ideas. At the same time, he has crafted a story that functions on a visceral level. There are genuine moments of suspense, dread, and emotional payoff. The incremental method, while requiring trust, so far has enhanced the mythic feeling of the work, making each new installment an event and an invitation to delve deeper. If Bush continues to execute with the same level of care, the full Stories of the Dead saga could very well become a standout example of metaphysical horror fiction, a work that sits comfortably alongside modern speculative literature while also entertaining the genre reader. Final Judgment. Stories of the Dead is a rare and compelling creation, a post-apocalyptic horror saga that transcends its genre trappings to become a meditation on meaning, morality, and human destiny. F.D. Bush has demonstrated remarkable ambition in designing a narrative that operates on multiple planes: the gritty human plane of survivors and zombies, and the lofty cosmic plane of archetypes and eternal laws. The first two narrative volumes, Psilocybin and The Red Wedding, succeed as engaging literature in their own right. They are written with a confident prose style, feature empathetic, if world-weary characters, and build an atmosphere of mounting dread tempered by flickers of hope. These novels alone would be a worthy addition to the horror canon, for their emphasis on why the apocalypse matters, not just how it happens. But Bush's achievement goes further by integrating the two doctrinal texts, which elevate the entire work into the realm of mythopoeic or speculative fiction of a high order. The Liber Anthropophaticus and Liber Initiatorum Mortis add layers of depth, philosophical, theological, and symbolic, that reward the careful reader with a sense of participating in a grand intellectual puzzle as well as a story. Through them, the series converses with traditions of Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and apocalyptic literature, yet carves out its own original cosmology. The thematic through lines of balance, knowledge, and survival bind every part of the project together, giving Stories of the Dead a cohesion that many straightforward novels lack. Is the work without flaws? A fair critique might point out that the very strengths that distinguish Stories of the Dead could alienate those who prefer their horror lean and unencumbered. The heavy use of archaic language in the scripture, the inclusion of an entire metaphysical treatise, and the deliberate pacing and introspection mark this series as not intended for the casual reader. There is a density of ideas that occasionally risks didacticism. One could imagine a reader feeling a bit lectured to when absorbing lines like "chance is the language of the unprepared." Every act sets something in motion. The harvest is not random, it is accounting. Yet, for the target audience of philosophical horror, this density is precisely the appeal. Bush provides ample terror and tragedy, but also a framework to think about that terror in a larger context. In doing so, he achieves a kind of modern myth-making. The incremental unveiling of the story, much like serialized epics of old, heightens this feeling. We are watching a new mythos being born in installments, and we have time to internalize each part. Ultimately, Stories of the Dead can be judged a success on both literary and philosophical grounds. Its literary merit lies in Bush's descriptive power, narrative structure, and character focus, which together make the horror resonate on a human level. Its philosophical merit is evident in the care with which it constructs an internally consistent doctrine that doubles as social commentary and existential inquiry. The series asks big questions about the cost of ignorance, the nature of equilibrium in life and society, and the possibility of finding meaning amid collapse, and courageously offers its own complex answers through story and scripture. Thematic cohesion is strong. One truly feels by the end of Volume 2 that all elements, from the mushroom tea by the campfire to the atrocities in the township church, are connected parts of one sweeping tapestry. The stylistic execution, while diverse, holds together under an umbrella of somber, almost reverent tone. And the narrative risks that Bush takes, whether in format or content, largely pay off by giving the work a distinct identity in a crowded genre. For readers interested in mythopoeia, speculative horror, and metaphysical fiction, Stories of the Dead offers an intoxicating blend. It sits at the nexus of horror and philosophy, delivering scenes of undead horror and human cruelty that satisfy the dark urges of the genre, while also inviting contemplation on why those scenes haunt us in the first place. Bush's universe is one where the walking dead are not only ghastly creatures, but also symbols and teachers, the world answering humanity honestly in its mirror of decay. The full story is still unfolding, but what has been released so far promises a work of significant vision. In an era when much horror leans either toward mindless thrills or overt moralism, Stories of the Dead strikes a rare balance, much like the equilibrium it so praises, between gripping narrative and profound reflection. In the words of the anthroprophetic text, thus is the anthroprophetic Bible sealed beneath the sign of eternal concord. Let balance be forever. Bush's work in its own right achieves a kind of concord between the thrills of horror and the insights of philosophy. It stands as a testament to what speculative horror can achieve when an author dares to infuse heart, intellect, and spirit into the stuff of nightmares. Sources: Stories of the Dead. Volume 1, Phil O'Sibin. Stories of the Dead. Volume 2, The Red Wedding. Liber Anthropropheticus, The Anthroprophetic Bible. Liber Initiatorum Mortis, The Three Witnesses.